Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the latest in our In Conversation series, tonight with Jo Swinson, who, apart from a brief interregnum between 2015 and 2017, has been the MP for East Dunbartonshire since 2005. She was a minister in the coalition, and she's now deputy leader of the Lib Dems and Foreign Affairs spokesperson. Last time at these events we had Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is the bookies' favourite to be Conservative leader. You're currently the bookies' favourite to be the next Lib Dem leader. I'm trying Emily Thornberry, but I'm getting nowhere. The format tonight will be the same as usual. We will chat for a little bit. You will get frustrated with my inability to ask a decent, sharp question. And then we'll throw it open to you, and you can ask whatever you want of Jo. Let's start with some questions about the Lib Dems as a party and where they are at the moment. It's almost impossible to go a day at the moment without some rumour or whisper of a new centre party being formed, a sensible, centrist, pro-European party. What does it say about the existing sensible, centrist, pro-European party that everyone seems to think we need a new one?
Well, I think one of the things is that it tells you a bit about tribalism in politics, because quite a few of the people that we'll talk about needing one have previously or currently are in another party, often the Labour Party, and I think the ability to decide that another party exists that actually is that answer is a bit more difficult if you're sort of dyed-in-the-wool Labour. I think the other thing is the other group of people who posit the idea of a new centrist party, I think often come with, let's just say, much less political experience and perhaps a naive view of how straightforward it is to, get stuck in, win elections, that democratic process, and particularly how easy or otherwise it is for a new political force to do that. And it's perhaps a bit of a cop-out as a Liberal Democrat, constantly blaming the voting system. But I do think the voting system that we have is actually underpins a lot of the dysfunctional nature of our current politics. So you've got a Labour Party, which in most European countries would not be one party. You've got a Conservative Party, ditto. You would not typically find Jacob Rees-Mogg and Anna Soubry in the same party, or John McDonnell and Liz Kendall in the same party. But yet, those are the two sort of massive behemoth parties that we have, partly because our voting system is stacked against new parties coming in, or even in the case of the Liberal Democrats, a third party, flourishing consistently, year after year, election after election. So I think that's actually part of the answer about, why a new centrist party isn't actually going to fly, and the Lib Dems are the best bet. But you're right. There's a question there about how successfully we get that message out there, and I think that will constantly be tested electorally. We are, if you look at the existing electoral tests in council by-elections, doing incredibly well. So I think there is some cause for cheer, but I equally think I think we'd be kidding if we said we had it all licked.
But is it also a problem, bluntly, with the brand? That for whatever reason, and however unfair you may think it is, and presumably do think it is, that part of the problem is that those 5 years in coalition mean that at the last election, the big electoral test, you weren't able to make the breakthrough that many of you maybe felt you would have done. I'm a marketer previously before I went into politics, so I do love branding, I think in the commercial world, you make slightly different decisions about branding, but we've Liberal Democrats. The clue is in the name. It's about our democratic system. It's about liberalism. So I think we've got the essentials there, and actually, if you certainly in the 2015 election, if you look at what led to us losing lots of seats, it wasn't actually people that were disgusted with the Liberal Democrats having gone into coalition. We lost most of the seats that we lost to the Conservatives because people who had voted Lib Dem then chose to vote Conservative. So these people weren't appalled at us going into coalition. So I think it's a lot more complex than just sort of assuming that somehow we're tarnished because we went into government. There definitely is an element where
having for many years picked up some of the protest vote and the sort of anti-establishment, that was harder to do as a governing party and as a party that's recently been in government. But I still think that, you're in politics to change things, and I still think that, the decision we made to go into government was the right decision. I'm not going to say every single individual decision we got right while we were there. Of course we made mistakes, but we got that big decision right, because you need to change the world if you're in politics. That's what it's about.
To those disaffected people in the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, of which there are many on both sides at the moment, what's your message? I mean, would your message be come and join us, or would your message be stay where you are and fight?
I think it depends on what the individual wants to do. I recognise that there are small L liberal people in other parties, and indeed on Brexit issues I am working very closely with those individuals, people like Chuka Umunna and Anna Soubry and Caroline Lucas, and while we might have disagreements on some things, actually there's a huge amount that we agree on. And clearly, if people, who have liberal values want to join the Lib Dems, they will be very welcome. But I do also recognise the value that individuals bring, by ploughing those furrows within their own parties. And so, and I also understand that for people to switch party, it's not a straightforward thing for them to do. So I'm not going to sort of judge people for not doing that. If people want to work with us and campaign jointly on issues where we agree and where we can, particularly in the arithmetic of the Parliament that we're in right now, where we can get real change, then I'm very open to finding ways to work with people in different parties. I think that's important. And as a Liberal, as someone who supports proportional representation, I am also a pluralist. So that's part of how I think politics should be done.
There's a really interesting paradox at the moment, it seems to me, which is that 20 years ago, we'd have taught politics and political parties in terms of sort of spatial dimension. And we'd have said that the Liberal Democrats would do really well when the other parties were far apart, because the other parties would move to the extremes and they would free up this space in the centre ground. And at the moment, the other parties are about as far apart as they've been since the 70s, and yet you're in opinion polls stuck on sort of 7-8 percentage points, even if doing a little bit better in some local by-elections. You did best when they were really close together. And I don't know what that tells us about contemporary politics, except perhaps that at the moment, politics is being painted in very primary colours, and people with so the appeal of Corbyn is clear. As I mentioned earlier, we had Jacob Rees-Mogg here last time, and his appeal is clear, even if not always to maybe you. What's the Liberal Democrat equivalent of the Corbyn phenomenon or Mogmentum?
I'm not sure.
I mean, is it just being sensible?
Well, this is it. I mean, being fairly reasonable and pragmatic isn't really in vogue at the moment. But call me old-fashioned. I think that it may come back in. I think it may come back into fashion. But I mean, partly because, first of all, I think the current situation feels quite unsustainable. So there's a big chunk of people who look with dismay at politics at the moment. Now, are they in opinion polls saying, actually, I've decided that it's the Lib Dems that I'm going to vote for? Well, they're not necessarily there yet, but I think they are far more in play in an electoral sense than even several months ago. So it may well be that we're able to capitalise on that. But I do really think this division, not just in politics, but in society, is a problem. And it's not just a sort of problem politically for the Lib Dems. I actually think it's a problem that more widely needs solving. The disregard for the facts, we've had enough of experts, and you get that on both sides of the sort of more extreme parts of the left and right of the political spectrum. I mean, Corbyn is great on kind of rhetoric and oratory and passion, but when you actually look at, do his plans add up, then it starts to fall apart. And, you'll find on the right, then, we just get this sort of fantasy world peddled by some of the arch Brexiteers about this land of milk and honey that's going to apparently appear. And I mean, I don't know if they realise that it's not going to appear, or if they just think if we get to after March 2019, it doesn't matter because we'll be out of the EU and then everyone will realise it and it'll be too late. But so it's sort of a suspended sort of reality that they're operating in. And you know, you could argue that one thing to do would be, well, you just have to get more extreme in the way you're talking about things. But that's also not how I want to do politics. So I want to find a way to connect and to, yes, be radical and bold on policy options, you know, where it's warranted, because I do think that lots of things about society aren't working, and that is what's called for, and I think there's appetite for that rightly. But I also want those things to be thought through, grounded in some kind of understanding, although some elements might be a risk, so that you can say, well, actually, yes, this is bold step, but we recognise that we think this will succeed for these reasons, and it's something which we're going to try to do. So that's where I think the future of sort of radical liberalism is. It's radical, but also reasonable and just rooted into in reality as well.
So if I was to say, what's the route back to 15%, let alone 20%? It's kind of sort of to wait until it all goes wrong, and then people will realise how sensible you are.
No. So I'm not absolving us of the need to do any work here. I think we do. I mean, you talked earlier about how we're now in a situation where there's a sort of politics on the extremes, which we perhaps had in the early 1980s. And in the 1990s and the early 2000s, you had this sort of consensus where all of the parties were sort of in the centre ground, and people were saying things like, why do you need the Liberal Democrats? And, you know, they're not saying that now in the same way, because, you know, you've got two parties that, in terms of the leadership, are pretty pro-Brexit. So you've got this space, as you say. But therefore, what we do need some different policy answers. We had the financial crash in 2008. That has had a massive impact on living standards, and yet we haven't radically changed the way the system works in terms of business, in terms of executive pay and so on. We've got this division in society as a result of the referendum, and, you know, sad news, I don't think it'll be any better 3 years on, because, you know, we're 4 years on from the Scottish independence referendum, and it's a pretty divided country still. And I think we need to find ways to heal that division, and I think politicians have got a responsibility, but I think there's probably wider efforts needed within communities on that to have some more cohesion as society. And it's not just referendum campaigns that do that, it's also the wider kind of trends in social media, echo chambers, and so on, which mean that there's much more fragmentation of where people are getting their news, their sources, and can end up in sort of belief circles where something feels like it's reality and perhaps is not. And I think we need to, as you know, liberals, as people of this sort of centre, you know, progressive politics, need to find better solutions to that. And I'm going to say I think we've got some of the building blocks already, but that's what I'm spending my time on. And I don't think they've got it sussed in any country, really. I think if you look at America, you look at the Democrats, they've been grappling with this issue. I look at plenty of the European parties. You know, this is a wider trend, but my goodness, I think it's one that we need to solve. We need to find those answers.
So last year there was the chance, obviously, to have a go at getting yourself back electorally, and you did okay in Scotland, and number of seats
quadrupled our seats in Scotland. I mean, I think by any measure that's pretty good.
From a very low base.
From 1 to 4, it's still quadrupling.
Yeah. If that's the measure of success.
Sorry, what, 48 next time round, that'd be. Yeah.
But actually the vote share went down, number of lost deposits went up. Why do you think the last election wasn't really a success? I mean, what went wrong?
Well, I think there's, first of all, I think there's different ways of judging the success.
Do you think it was a success?
So in some ways it was. So in the aftermath of 2015, you've got to remember, you know, we'd gone from 57 MPs to 8. People were writing us off. You know, can the Liberal Democrats survive? You know, there was basically an existential fight for survival. And you know what? When you've gone down to 8 seats, the ability of the other parties to pick you off as well. You know, it's not just, oh, well, then we've gone down to our lowest possible. I mean, actually, you've got much less of a solid base in order to push outwards from. So I think, you know, we did one of the basic things that we needed to do out of that election, which was to hold our ground and ideally to expand, and we did that. You know, we went from 8 MPs from the previous election to 12 MPs. I think also important, we improved our diversity significantly, and we've got a good mix with new blood. 4 of those MPs had never been MPs before, so we've got the sort of new talent coming through, and that is also important. But would I have liked us to have many more? Clearly. Now, it was a short notice election. I tell you what, the number of people I told very confidently Theresa May wasn't going to call an election. You can tell she doesn't want to do it. I mean, I think she didn't want to do it, and then obviously was talked into it on an alpine walk or wherever she was, and was pretty much regretting it. So I didn't think there was going to be an election, and you know, that presents its own challenges. Yes, you know, for all parties, but you know, certainly for us, where the on the ground constituency work in the run up to an election is so important. And it was a very polarising election, and that is one of the things where, as you say, when all the parties are very close together, we did well. Well, I think one of the things was people weren't so scared of the alternative. You know, Conservatives who weren't terrified of, you know, Tony Blair being in number 10 could vote Liberal Democrat with a, you know, fairly easy conscience to get a great Liberal Democrat MP in their local area, because they weren't petrified of what a Blair government would do. And you know, that was not the case even with Ed Miliband, and certainly in terms of Jeremy Corbyn. And there'd be lots of Conservatives that would say the most important thing to me is to make sure that we don't have Jeremy Corbyn in number 10. And ditto, you've now got, on a more polarised situation, you know, there was a lot of people, the sort of reluctant Corbyn voters, who, you know, with a heavy heart voted Labour because they didn't like Labour's position on Brexit, but they felt the most important thing was to try to stop a Conservative majority. So that polarisation, you know, doesn't necessarily help us as a party. So, you know, we had some success, and we need to use that as a springboard to have more. I also think the whole issue of Brexit, for all that it was an election sort of cold, you know, on that issue, a lot of the really damaging stuff was not yet in the public domain. You know, the debate, I think, on that, I think public mood on that, you know, is not changing swiftly, but there has been some shift. And I think our position was absolutely right to say that the country deserves to have a say on the final deal, and to look at the evidence once the negotiation is complete and to make that decision. At the time that we had that policy at the election last June, that was a pretty far out position to take. And now that is the popular position amongst the public, and indeed many politicians from different parties are supporting that position.
Do you think that it helped that you spent the first 2 weeks of the election campaign running a theology seminar?
Probably not, if I'm honest, you know. But you know, that'll be well poured over in the cephalological history books, I'm sure.
Well, I'm writing it, so it will be. Did you have any sympathy for Tim Farron? Because I've spoken to quite a few Liberal Democrat candidates who say, you know, they would have their head in their hands during some of these interviews, and in fact several members of his team have said they would have their head in their hand during these interviews. But if I ask you a series of questions about things you believe are or are not sin, presumably you don't believe in sin, and therefore
I'm a humanist. I don't even believe in God. So
exactly,
I mean,
exactly, and therefore you've got to get out of jail free card on this, right? But he doesn't. He does believe in God, and therefore he does believe in sin. And did you have any sympathy for him, for the tension between his beliefs and the manifestation of your policy?
Well, I mean, my husband's a Christian. I know lots of Christians who have no problem whatsoever with being, you know, full-hearted in support of gay rights, and not just in support of gay rights, but in not perceiving being gay to be a sin. And they don't find that conflicts with their Christianity. Clearly, Tim has a different view. And so, you know, can I feel for somebody who's being asked a question, in essence, to which there is no right answer to? You know, of course, you can understand the sort of trials. I mean, it probably would have been better to have, you know, gamed that one in terms of, practicing different answers in advance to work it out. But, we are where we are. But it was not helpful for the campaign. We're a Liberal Party, and I think it is important that we send a very clear message. I mean, sort of theological discussions. I mean, this is where I have something. That is not necessarily what politicians should be held to account on. He was not running for Pope, as he said at one point, which I thought was quite a good way of putting it. But we're still in a world where, in parts of in countries around the world, people are still executed for being gay. And in this country, there are still, huge amounts of hate crime, discrimination, prejudice, everyday bigotry that people come up against. And in those circumstances, I think it is particularly important to show leadership and to be inclusive, and particularly for a Liberal leader. And that was basically the problem.
You talked earlier about the referendum, and your policy. I always get into trouble with Liberal Democrats on this because I get the wording wrong. Yeah. Because I stumble and say it's a second referendum, and they jump on me. They jump on me and beat me up and say it's not a second referendum. It's a first referendum on the deal.
Yeah.
Very important distinction. I get that. If we apply that to Scotland, you're opposed to another referendum on
the same question that we had last time.
Yeah. But assuming one happens, and assuming the independence case wins, would you then insist on a referendum on the deal?
Well, I think there's a fair case for that. I think one of the difficulties that people have in an independence referendum or in a referendum on staying in the EU or not is that the status quo option is fairly well understood. I mean, not perfectly understood, and you could ask lots of people intricate constitutional questions about setups that they would get wrong. But people have a rough idea of what the status quo looks like. But the people who are arguing for change, they're painting a picture which could just be a pile of nonsense. And actually, they might have a picture of a vision for what they want to achieve that then turns out to be unachievable because it is the result of a negotiation with other parties over whom you don't have control. So I think, given that people will be voting on a premise, there is a very strong argument, unless you had something where, one of the arguments I would say in Scotland, to be fair to the SNP, not words you will normally hear me utter, but to be fair to the SNP, they produced a white paper, which was a pretty substantial document about what their vision for an independent Scotland would be.
But it was still their vision. It wasn't necessarily what would happen. True.
But so in the circumstance where what then was negotiated was very, very similar to their white paper document, then I can see how you might have a scenario where you'd say, well, you don't need a referendum because with the white paper, look, actually on almost every point, this is what we've negotiated and people have voted on that basis. Whereas if you had something that was negotiated that was drastically different to that white paper, you could compare and contrast and say, well, hang on, people voted on the basis of this white paper. That's not what's on offer now, so we should have a referendum to check if that's still what people want to do now that they can see that the path is not quite as was outlined, and they might still choose to do that. So I think it's about, when you're making a massive constitutional step, it's about taking people with you and making sure that you're doing that, making sure that people have the right information at the right time. And it is very difficult before you've even conducted a negotiation to put all of that detail there.
This next bit is going to sound like one of those awful talk shows where someone says, I've really enjoyed your book, and there is a book. But I did really enjoy I enjoyed the chapter I've read, which is only the first chapter. But it's the chapter on politics, and so I thought I kind of should read the chapter on politics.
Yeah.
There's a fascinating story in there about how you became persuaded about the merits of all women shortlists.
Yeah.
In fact, I might talk about this a bit.
Fascinating, depressing story.
Well,
really.
because you were adamantly against all women shortlists.
I literally had the T-shirt against all women shortlists when I made my speech against all women shortlists in 2001. I had a pink T-shirt that said, "I am not a token woman." And I led the fight against that at Lib Dem conference when I was 21. And I said, I didn't say we don't need to do anything, because I realised the massive lack of women in our parliamentary party. At that time, we had, I think, 5 women out of 3 women out of 40, no, 5 women out of 47, something like that. And it was pretty dire. But I said, what we need to do is have a massive campaign to go out to talent spot, to support, to encourage women to stand for election at all levels of the party, for local council, for devolved assemblies, for parliament. And then I worked really hard to try to make that happen. I had the fights about getting the budget, you know, the endless fights over whether we could get 20 grand out of the party's entire budget to employ somebody, to organise things. And it just wasn't important enough to enough people at the top. And that sometimes was just a failure of leadership. Some of that I also understood. You know, I get that when you're running a local party and you're a volunteer and you're trying to make sure you print the leaflets and you field a full slate of candidates for the council and you do all of these other things, then you'd like to have more diversity, but have you really got the capacity to go out and ask lots of people? You might think you'd like to do it, but then you don't get round to it. I sort of understand that. You know, I've spent a lot of time as a volunteer in the Lib Dems myself. And that's what I really came to the conclusion, that to make it both urgent and important, you just need to force the issue by saying to people, you have to go and find women candidates, because otherwise you won't have any candidates, because these seats are going to be all women shortlists. And I think that we need to apply similar measures. So there's some legal issues about exactly what you can do, but on other underrepresented groups as well. You know, we've now got 1/3 of our MPs are women. It's not job done, and that's, you know, a great step forward, but we shouldn't be complacent. But we're still a largely white party in terms of our electoral representation, and that's problematic too. But yeah, I mean, I concluded that that was what it would take. I don't think it is the only way to get change, but I think the level of political leadership you need without it is exceptional. Absolutely exceptional, and very difficult to achieve.
When you talk about other groups, when you look at the House of Commons, what is the one group that you most think is missing?
Oh, I'm going to reject that question. I don't think we should pit different underrepresented groups against one another.
But you have done. You start to list some. So I'm asking you which ones you think are numerically the most underrepresented.
Well, we could do the maths on it, and I haven't done the full maths. I mean, you know, clearly BME is very underrepresented. It's always hard to tell exactly how underrepresented LGBT is. Not everybody will obviously be out, and of course disability. You know, some people will be. Age is another one where there's underrepresentation. So there is a whole range of groups, and then you've got socioeconomic underrepresentation, which is actually getting worse in Parliament. And I, along with Hazel Blears and Erica Lorenshaw, helped co-found the Speaker's Parliamentary Placement Scheme to try to provide different routes into parliamentary work opportunities for people who, you know, are not in that sort of gilded Surrey lifestyle where they get to go and intern for free for years while living in central London and get all of that experience and then become a researcher in Parliament and then, you know, become a member of Parliament. You know, we need to make sure there's a range of different routes into doing it. So, you know, I think all of those inequalities need to be addressed.
There's a lot in the book. I mean, some of it actually almost hand in the mouth, jaw-dropping stuff about changes in attitudes over time as a result of getting more women MPs. There's a very revealing interview you do with Shirley Williams about her experience. But what do you think the biggest policy difference, external effect of having more women MPs has been?
So the big change was 1997. I mean, again, academics like you will probably have analysed the numbers and so on, but my understanding is that issues of domestic violence and of childcare type issues are raised much, much more as a result of having more women in the chamber. But I don't think it's just about also these issues then get raised. I think it's also about how issues get raised, what types of issues get raised within debates and those different perspectives, and also even a bit of the ways of doing politics. I mean, we're talking about generalizations here, but I think you know, there are some different styles that different people bring, that sometimes you'll get, you know, men that won't have that sort of alpha male style, and I think to have a better range of approaches to politics amongst men and women is helpful, like PMQs, is not the most enlightening thing.
Yeah, although women are quite good at shouting at PMQs as well, I've noticed.
Yeah, I'm not. As I say, it's not entirely a gendered thing. But I think there is. Well, my experience sitting in there is that there's more kind of noise from the blokes. I mean, there's some weird noises in PMQs. I often remember thinking that some of them, and they would be like replicated. You know, people are clearly like sort of, you know, got their PMQ noise that would be some kind of zoo animal type noise, and they, you know, they would do the same thing again and again. Yeah, it's a bit of theatre, but it's not Parliament at its best at all.
You used the word, I think, naive. You used it earlier, actually, and you use it twice in the first chapter about yourself. Once in terms of thinking you could achieve this change in female representation without all women shortlists. But you then also use it, I thought it was a really interesting section where you discussed how in opposition you thought ministers were sort of all deciding. There's a phrase, I hadn't realised all the constraints that ministers were working under. I naively assumed individual ministers could just snap their fingers and make a decision to accept an amendment to a bill they were taking through Parliament. And I just wonder whether, when you went into government, you had more sympathy for people that had done the job before, because you realise the constraints they work under and the cross pressures they work under.
Well, I find I sometimes long for the days of opposition where I could just say the simple soundbite and mean it, because I used to say it and mean it, and so that was fine. And now I just know the world's a bit more complicated. I can't unknow that. And so it does, you know, and I'm sort of determined not to just go for the easy soundbite, but to try to add some value and make an intelligent criticism about something that could actually be changed. But I do think I had no idea about how government worked. I mean, even things like clearance, how a position got agreed across government, and how long that took. So you'd be thinking when you had a private member's bill, or you were supporting someone else's private member's bill, that, you know, it was really important to get lots of people writing in on the Wednesday and Thursday before it was being heard on a Friday. And I'm thinking now, well, it's been decided like a week before whether the government's going to support it or not. And so even if there's a big campaign at that point, it's kind of too late. So I think, and I don't think that's unusual actually, because I think a lot of the organisations out there that lobby, you know, don't necessarily understand how those decisions are made, yeah, you end up thinking the ministers got it all at their disposal, but you know, they're often being sent out there and occasionally being sent out to defend a line that they might not entirely think is the best way forward, but has been agreed through collective agreement, and then will be put there. And I mean, I sometimes felt it was my responsibility to give credit where it was due from the dispatch box to, you know, if something was really, I mean, we ought to make sure the Conservatives get the credit for this particular announcement that I'm here to defend today. But yeah, it was sometimes challenging.
How much further do you think the sort of Me Too movement has to go at Westminster?
Well, I think it's not just at Westminster. I think there's a huge way to go more generally. And I still think there's parts of society that just don't get this. And I mean, I loved the President's Club expose that was done by the FT. I thought it was amazing that it was done by the FT, which is exactly where it needs to be. That's the people reading it that need to, you know, see this stuff. But the letters page of the FT in the following days, oh, what a shocker. I mean, fair play to them for publishing the letters, but you know, we had letters talking about the silly young girls at the President's Club. And I love the tweet that talked about how, so let's get this straight, all the women that were there knew exactly what they were getting into, but all the men that were there had no idea what it was about, and they left before it started. I mean, the double standards that we just saw applied in that whole thing were shocking. But that is it. I mean, there's people going there, well, what's the fuss about? I mean, well, they were being paid money, so they were, they were being groped a bit. What's the problem? And that is the problem. It's that attitude. And
so do you think the authorities at Westminster are on top of this?
Yeah, well, I was involved in the cross-party working group. We've published a very serious report with some really good recommendations. They still will need to be passed by Parliament in a vote within the next few weeks, and then further details hammered out. But that is moving at a good pace while taking care to get it right. And that's helpful, but that is, I mean, we've been looking at how do you put in place a complaints procedure that's independent and then you can deal with it when there's problems. But the biggest thing we need to do is change the culture so this stuff doesn't happen in the first place. And one of the things that I fought very hard for in that working group, which we got, is an agreement that there should be compulsory training. And, you know, of MPs and staff, and particularly anyone who's employing members of staff. And I did an interview with John Humphreys on the Today programme about this, and he was kind of going, well, what, the MPs need training? That, you know, are you really saying they don't know what sexual harassment is? And the point is there's loads of people out there that don't know what it is because they've been doing this. They either don't know or they don't care. And that will include some MPs, there's 650. So yeah, we need to make sure everyone's trained. But the fact that that's a sort of apparent sensible line of questioning for a mainstream interviewer also speaks volumes about, you know, what people think of this issue, and that, you know, that the government's now rolling back on compulsory education on sex and relationships. I'm just dismayed. I'm like, you know, what more evidence do you need that teaching young people about consent, teaching all young people about consent, is absolutely essential than this mess and all of these scandals that we still keep coming across? And, you know, we've seen Weinstein, we've seen Parliament, the charity sector. You know, you can say, oh, that's a problem. Yeah, every political party, right? Society, right? I mean, you know, do we think there's no sexual harassment going on at this university? Of course not. The statistics about sexual harassment in universities are terrifying. And even in schools, this happens to women and some men, but almost every woman will have experiences of harassment at various points in their lives. The age at which young people first experience it, for girls, it's often in their early teenage years, if not earlier. You know, this is just not on, and the Me Too movement is brilliant for standing up, people having solidarity to say that, and it has got a long way to go because there's a big problem to change. And so, yeah, I think it will keep growing, and I think people will draw power from one another and keep taking action until it's taken seriously.
If you're going to do it properly. I'm going to wrap up soon, but I have two questions I always ask. But before I do ask those questions, given Theresa May has made a speech today on university fees, as the party that took a lot of flack for introducing the current scheme, how do you look at her announcement?
Well, I think it's helpful that some of the worst elements of the system, particularly the ones that the Conservatives have introduced since 2015, such as getting rid of maintenance grants. I think it's very helpful that that's now on the table and can be looked at. Because I think one of the difficulties about this debate is that there's so much focus on tuition fees. I understand that that's a big issue. But when I speak to young people at university, the issue of living costs is easily as much, if not more, of a barrier. You know, some people are fortunate enough to have parents that will support them throughout university. For many people, that's not the case, either because they, you know, don't have that relationship with their parents or because their parents aren't able to. And in those cases, you know, how you actually make sure you pay your rent for your hall's residence, you are able to, you know, buy your textbooks, make sure you're, you know, well fed. And, you know, I mean, I worked part-time jobs, you know, throughout my university degree. But even if people are doing that, I mean, you still need to have time to study. That's what the point of coming to university is about. So I think that living costs issue is one that deserves more airtime than it currently gets. But there's no magic answer to this. I mean, Labour like to say there's a magic answer to this, but you know, in reality, unless we have a massive increase in taxation, there's no magic answer to the funding of higher education. I mean, in Scotland, you know, there's a good situation. You know, we got rid of tuition fees when we were in government in Scotland. But what you've now had is you've had the grants rolled back by the SNP government, you've had massive cuts in further education, you know, huge numbers of college places lost, and Scottish universities are now constraining the students that they can take from Scotland because in order to make their finances add up, then they have to have a higher proportion of international students. So, you know, you can look at how amazing something is in another place, and actually there's downsides there too. So, we've got a review ongoing in the Lib Dems as well to look again at this issue, and it'll be interesting to see where that ends up. We clearly got the politics appallingly badly wrong, and I said we made some mistakes in government, and this would be pretty high on my list.
But would it be on your list politically or in policy terms? Because in policy terms, largely it's done the things that you said it would do.
So I think the biggest problems were in the politics, given what had been in our manifesto before the election, and so that was the biggest problem. I think in terms of once you were in the realms of how you design a policy that tries to help more young people from lower income backgrounds go to university and protect funding for the university sector, we actually delivered quite a good policy. We made it much more progressive than the existing policy. We raised the threshold at which you started paying back from 15,000 to 21,000. So that meant for young people in their first or second job earning, they were able to keep more of what they were earning each month. And we were able to make sure we put a lot of extra resources into helping improve access, which I think is a massive issue, and successfully did so. So I mean, a lot of that policy detail, within that realm of if you're going to do this, how do you do it? I think we got that right, but I mean, there's no doubt the politics of it were disastrous.
Okay, two quick questions, and then we'll go to the audience, and these are the ones I ask everybody. When you were growing up, who was your political hero?
Well, I'm going to say somebody who's not actually a politician, but I think she was a political hero, Anita Roddick. She founded the Body Shop, and as well as being a very successful businesswoman, she also showed that business could be a force for good. She campaigned on everything from fair trade to workers' rights to ending cosmetic testing on animals and safeguarding the environment. And I think she was a total inspiration, showing how you could do politics in ways without even being a formal politician.
That's such a 1980s answer.
Oh, well, I was born in 1980, so in my defence.
And if you had any advice for a young aspiring politician, what would it be?
I mean, the first thing I would say is do it, right? Politics is where you can get involved and change the world, and if there's things that you think are wrong about the world that you want to change, and I would entirely understand if you do think that at the moment, then it is a great way to get involved and to do it. And so I would say find the party that chimes with your values and beliefs. I'd love it if that's the Lib Dems, and if so, by all means, get in touch. But if that's another party, I'd encourage people to get involved, wherever their political home is, and then get stuck in. And the one thing I would say that you probably need to develop is a support network and resilience, because you need to learn to lose as well as to win in politics.
Okay, we're going to take questions from the audience. Just a word on questions. Questions should be a question. It should be a sentence that ends with a question mark. It shouldn't contain the words, I have 3 points. And it shouldn't contain the words secondly, thirdly, or if you're a Liberal Democrat, ninthly. So we've got some microphones. I'll take the chap with specs here, and the woman there. Yes, please, yeah. And we'll take 2 questions, and then we'll do 2 answers together. So please.
Without going into a post-mortem of Tim Farron's interviewing prowess, to what extent is the Liberal Democrats really liberal and tolerant if a man cannot hold a job and his job becomes untenable because he has a certain worldview?
Okay, and yeah.
I recently read Nick Clegg's book, How to Stop Brexit, which ended with a checklist of things to do, things like march, write your MP. But the final thing he recommended was that we should all join the Labour Party because that's where it will get stopped. Do you agree?
Well, you're a difficult one. So yeah, I think we are a liberal and tolerant party. I share an office with Tim Farron in Parliament. He is a valued member of the Liberal Democrats. He's, still actively campaigning as an MP. He came to the conclusion personally that he couldn't combine being the leader of the party with, his views and the scrutiny on some elements of those that entails. And, I when I spoke to him about it, I actually I was encouraging him to stay on shortly after the election. He told me that, he'd come to this conclusion actually during the election campaign. And, I could see sort of etched on his face the sort of the turmoil he was facing. And, you can't force somebody to continue doing a job that's making them miserable. We can't prevent the media asking questions like that. So if that's going to make him miserable, and of course, of the party, and we have got lots of people from all sorts of different faiths, in the Lib Dems, and rightly so, and we have lively debates all the time.
What do you think would have happened if, instead of equivocating, which he clearly was doing because he was torn, he'd simply said, yes, I believe it's a sin, but I'm a liberal, and therefore I believe that we shouldn't punish people for their sin, we should legislate for people to be free.
I mean, I think in one of his formulations he kind of tried to say that.
He tried, yes, yeah. Never quite as openly as that.
Yeah, but I mean, there's... how long that would have lasted in terms of the media. I mean, that's the thing. I don't know what the perfect answer to the question is, because I find it slightly difficult to come from the situation where well, that's not something I feel comfortable saying. I suppose you either say it's not for me to, share those private issues on sin, which he also tried. And I mean, sometimes with media scrutiny, there's not necessarily fairness when you're a public figure as leader of a political party, then even things which to most people we rightly defend the right for those to be purely private issues, they sometimes become issues of interest, and it's a bit difficult to therefore keep things entirely private. And you have similar issues when you've had obviously in slightly different issues where you've had politicians who've been saying one thing about the education system and then making a decision about where to send their child to school. Now, in normal circumstances, I would say it's really not fair game for the media to be intruding in where the decisions somebody's making about their child and bringing that into it. But in those particular circumstances, then it would be brought into it. So as I say, we don't control the media, rightly. We don't control the media, and so it's not like there was an easy answer to that. And Tim came to the conclusion that he did about what for him was the ultimate thing that he had to do. In terms of the question, should everyone join Labour? No. I'm not sure that's exactly what he said. I think what he was saying was, if you're sort of Labour-minded, then join Labour. And actually, I think he also suggested if you're kind of Conservative, if you're naturally a Conservative, but you just don't happen to be a member of the party and you're anti-Brexit, then join the party and make your voice heard. So that's not the only answer. But I would say I do like a book that gives a little checklist of things that you can do. And he might have had one at the end of the book. I've got one at the end of every chapter.
I wouldn't know that because I've only read the first chapter. We'll take the woman down here, please. Right, the sort of third row back, and go on. Yeah. And then Guy in the black shirt. So about 6 rows down with his hand in the air, black hair. Yeah. Yes, please.
Is there a risk that the Good Friday Agreement will be sacrificed on the altar of Brexit by the Conservatives?
And if we can get the mic across to Guy.
Hello.
This better be great, because the anticipation is now building.
Hi, Guy from the Queen Mary Liberal Democrats. I just wanted to ask, as Phil has pointed out in the book, you talk about beyond cultural changes in the party, sometimes we need significant structural changes. The Lord Alderdice report came out about 2 weeks ago and recommended that beyond a structural change, we need a cultural change in the party. I just wonder what you think that would look like in sort of manifested form at local level, and what you make of the report as a whole, and how we can reach out to BME communities, because it's clearly one of the most important things that we can do in our future.
Sure.
So that was a Liberal Democrat, and there were at least 3 questions in there.
If it had been Simon Hughes, it would have been 16. So first of all, on the Good Friday Agreement, I think that's a huge risk. And I think it's one of the many dismaying things about Brexit, number 428 or something. But it is absolutely terrifying that, you have a great success story there, and, it's not all perfect, as we know, but, you basically have had, a peace process that has been, successful for 20 years, and that is now at risk, and it's sort of cavalierly at risk. I know that's not a word, but you know what I mean. It just, with this sort of attitude that almost like, well, we haven't really thought about it, I'm sure there'll be an answer somehow, but it doesn't really matter because it's Northern Ireland. It is almost what it feels like. With this fudge that was created just before Christmas of saying that we'll have this regulatory alignment. Is that what was agreed in the end, or was it no divergence? Anyway, the dancing on a head of a pin with the language of saying that you'll basically have that agreement, but then everyone else, in Scotland and Wales and everyone, we'd like that too. Thank you very much. But the real truth is you can't have that if you're not going to be in the customs union at least, and that's what is also apparently a red line. So it does not being taken seriously enough by the government, and one of many reasons why people should buy Nick Clegg's book on how to stop Brexit and take action to stop it, because we've got an opportunity, right? We have not left the European Union yet, right? It's not yet the end of March 2019, and there is all to play for. And if you believe that Brexit is the wrong course for this country, then this is the pivotal year to get out there, to campaign, to win the argument. Because let me be really clear. If public opinion shifts much more decisively than it has already, then the political pressure to provide the opportunity for people to have a say, and then to have that opportunity to then reject Brexit, I think that gains a momentum that is potentially unstoppable. So, do not despair. We have, this is not inevitable. Our European partners have said very clearly to us, sort of, if you change your mind, we can just sort of rip up that Article 50 letter. We'll pretend it never happened, and we really ought to be using this time this year to make that happen. Do
you really think we would be readmitted without having to abide by Schengen, for example?
I think, I've certainly, in the past few months, I've spoken to the Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland, French and German ambassador, Bulgarian ambassador. There is the words I think that the Irish Deputy PM said was, there would be extreme generosity if we decided to that we wanted to stay, because it's worse for us, but Brexit is also pain for the other countries in the EU. They don't want it to happen, and so I think if we haven't yet left, then the ability for them to say by agreement that Article 50 basically ceases and we continue as we were is absolutely on the table. And you wouldn't be worried,
your get out here presumably is the referendum on the deal, because there must be a real risk of a significant chunk of the country, a third, maybe more, feeling.
I'm not blind to the difficulties about this, but I do happen to believe that what we're on the brink of doing is so amazingly bad for our economic prospects, for our future influence in the world, for the whole opportunities that the next generation is going to have, that we need to take the chance and to try to make sure that we can choose a different path. And I absolutely agree that this process started with a full vote of the British people, and so if there is to be a change in direction, that can't just be something which is decided in Parliament or whatever. That needs to be something which is endorsed by the people fairly in a referendum, and I think that's what we've been proposing and setting out for many months now, and which, as I say, more people are coming round to the view that that's something which would be a good way forward.
But if it's a referendum on the deal, we don't really mean the deal, we mean the transition arrangements, because we won't even know what the deal is. When does that referendum take place? When is the campaign?
We've said it should take place at the end of this year.
But we won't even know the terms of the transition arrangement by the end of this year.
Well, there'll be
So
heads of agreement.
we'll be having a referendum on an unknown transition arrangement that might lead to an unknown deal.
I could refer you to the comments from David Davis and Liam Fox about how these deals would all be done and dusted within about 6 months.
Yeah, but just because they were wrong doesn't give you a get out.
We already have more of an idea of the shape. We already know, for example, the government is pursuing a Brexit that means not being in the customs union, not being in the single market. I mean, that in itself is more information than we had back in June 2016, when plenty of Brexiteers merrily trotted out and said we can be like Norway and we'll have this. And no one's suggesting leaving the single market. Dan Hannan would say, confidently down the camera lens. So, we already have more information, and the shape of the deal will be clearer to us. People will be in possession of any more facts than were possible to have in June 2016.
Okay, but they still won't know we'll still be voting on something we don't know.
Well, I mean, the alternative is that you don't have a vote at all, and then you have a deal imposed on you, and you don't have a chance to do anything about it. So, I mean, I can get your argument that there's a kind of imperfections on this, but I think the imperfections of that are much better than, you don't even know what it's going to be, and then you just get whatever you're given.
Okay, and Guy's question.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a really important piece of work. And it's quite tough reading for the party, but rightly so, because I think this is an issue, and this is a review about race in the party and race equality. We are far too white as a party, and that's, from our membership all the way through to the different parts of our, elected bodies and decision-making structures. And so we do need to get really serious about tackling that culturally, and that involves, everything from training programs to some quite difficult conversations actually with some people who need to be called out on stuff, and I think society is delightfully changing on all of these issues, and where you have institutions that haven't kept pace, and many organisations in society would be in a similar situation, then it's right that we have a proper root and branch look at what we need to do. And so I know the different structures of the party are looking at the review and then basically coming forward with, right, what's the action plan? And I think the action plan is the absolutely concrete thing. And I know the federal board, this is getting a bit wonky and sort of Lib Dem, but the federal board is basically going to have this as a very closely monitored plan of what happens at all levels of the party to implement this review.
Okay, take the woman on the front row here, and then we'll take the chap with specs on the end there. Yes, please.
Hi. Do you think it is perhaps telling that the Lib Dems as a party most probably don't have a well-formulated offer to women, that when Philip asked you earlier about any policies that have been reenacted because there's a surge of women in Parliament, things that perhaps I'm surmising Emily Thornberry wouldn't struggle to mention, such as the minimum wage, the protections for working mothers, and the paid maternity leave, the three things that are the most fundamental in lifting children from poverty, etc., is something that you necessarily did not mention. Is that because those things have already been covered and therefore there's a need for a new offer and none of the three parties have got something? Or is that because the Lib Dems perhaps are busy with maybe other things, such as Brexit?
Well, I think with some of those things, I think it's arguable whether that was the influence. I think the minimum wage, for example, it happened to coincide with that influx of women, but I think that was already in Labour's sort of policy covered quite some time before that. And to be honest, the paid maternity leave, I suspect, might have predated that big influx of women, but maybe I'm not exactly right on the dates of that. I would have imagined that would probably have been pre-97. But I think I wasn't answering it from a sort of party perspective. When I was a minister, the thing I was proudest of doing was introducing shared parental leave, because I very strongly believe that in order to get equality in the workplace, we need to have much more equality at home. And I'm not going to say should parental leave is perfect, not least because we have to deliver it in a coalition, but it's a really important step to where we need to get to. And recognising that gender equality is actually not just about women. So most of the negative impacts of gender inequality do fall on women, but some of them also fall on men. And the way in which fathers are treated in this society, the way they are assumed to be incompetent, and they totally are, and they are, undervalued. I mean, it is almost sort of laughable sometimes. I'll share stories with my husband about, what people have felt able to come up to him and say on the bus when he happens to be on the bus with our son who's got a big gash on his head, and he hit his head at nursery, right? So it wasn't like it was my husband's fault, but suddenly the unsolicited advice, because people assume that he's just been incapable of being a dad, and so we do need to recognise those elements of gender inequality. And also, in order to change the workplace, if you have a wider range of men and women together who are wanting more flexibility, more modern ways of working, then I think you'll get that change more quickly. And the other thing which I managed to do in government, which I think will also be the beginning of a much bigger conversation, and already is, was winning the fight to get the gender pay reporting in, which we fought the Conservatives for 5 years on. And then finally at the last minute, there was like an opportunity I spotted, because the Tories didn't want to lose the small business bill, which I also didn't want to lose. It was also partly my bill, but I thought they'd blink first, and they did. So we basically got them to agree to gender pay gap reporting, which is now just coming into force. And we've started to see what pay transparency can do, because what it really does is it makes people ask other questions, and it will then go from there. So there's still a lot more that needs to be done, and I recognise that. And also around, the list is, I've written 90,000 words on it. There is so much that still needs to be done, and culturally as well, though. And I think government's got an important role to play in that. And some of the stuff I felt quite proud of was being able to use the government on things like the body image campaign that I ran, and without legislating, but nonetheless give prominence to issues and campaigners that were really making a difference to people's lives. But for example, I tried to get a review of media sexism, which was totally blocked by the Conservatives. And I still think, the way in which women are portrayed day in, day out in the media is still one of the things that is the wallpaper that, reinforces the assumptions and the stereotypes and holds women back. So, there's a huge amount still to be done by the government, but there is too much for government to do on its own. We also need a sort of movement of taking action in their everyday lives.
I think there's a special stare that mums have for dads at the school gate. It's a sort of, here he is, the useless dad, come to pick up his child. I mean, it's partly because I am pretty useless, but as a father, but I do.
Believe me, you can be quite useless as a mother too.
But you can exactly. They I see the contempt in their eyes as I approach the school gate. Sorry, the chap up there with the glasses. Yes, please.
Hello. Do you think there are any liberal arguments for Brexit in terms of devolution, free trade or immigration, or is it all bad news? And if so, why?
I'm thinking hard now. No, I don't... Well, I suppose the liberal argument for Brexit would be the pure sovereignty argument in terms of that sort of freedom issue over your own affairs. That would be the argument. And there is a respectable argument to be made that says, I believe it is just more important that we have all of that sovereignty, even if we are poorer, even if we have less influence, even if we have less enrichment of our culture through greater trade and movement of people between countries. I disagree with that, but that is what I would say would be the sort of respectable argument. And the difficulty is that's not the argument that gets made. It's a sort of have your cake and eat it argument, which Boris famously makes, which suggests that and you can not have any, you can have no jurisdiction from anyone else over your own laws, but somehow you'll be allowed to create trade deals, but they won't be able to require you to...
Isn't there about trade, which is, for example, we can trade with another country, and when we trade with them, our manufacturers have to uphold those standards, but we don't have to impose those standards on the rest of the country. I mean, that's the argument that's made. I mean, or I could think about arguments about the ability to have immigration from anywhere in the world rather than...
But it's not like we don't have that ability. We do have that ability. We've got a government that has a ridiculous false cap on immigration numbers that is unachievable anyway without doing huge economic harm, and doesn't seem to serve any other purpose than a purely political one. So, you know, it's not like being a member of the EU stops us having immigration from other parts of the world.
No, but because it's imbalanced. I mean, for example, Diane Abbott's argument always was that, and the argument from people on the left of the Labour Party was that it was effectively a racist organisation, wasn't it? Because you had immigration from Eastern Europe, which was uncontrolled and which was white, and because you had large numbers coming in from Eastern Europe, you therefore were basically forced to put up caps against the rest of the world, which is non-white. And I could imagine a situation in which someone on the left might say it would be better to have equal immigration from anywhere in the world and not on a racist basis.
Except nobody was really making that argument, because that's not actually the position of anyone that's supporting Brexit that I can see.
No, but that's true. But it's an argument that you could make, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I personally take the view that we, through the European Union, we are able to be part of the most successful peace project of all time. We're able to be part of a trading area where we have much more clout economically and also politically. Our companies have an ability, therefore, to grow more easily because they're part of this huge market, and then from there they're able to use that as a stepping stone. You've got the reduced transaction costs, you've got the reduced regulatory burdens, and it doesn't stop you making trade deals with the rest of the world. I mean, Germany trades a lot more with China than we do. They're a member of the European Union. It's not as if this is problematic. So, I really remain to be convinced of
They're not able to make their own trade deal with China, are they?
But it's not that the trade deal is what's constraining us in terms of exporting and trading with China. I mean, that's not the issue. It's not the deals that have been done. And actually, being able to do deals as part of a bigger entity gives you much more clout in those negotiations than what we're going to have. And I mean, as you say, you might, if you don't happen to like the regulatory standards that are imposed, then you might take the view that you would like to not have them. But I'm not sure I really want to be eating chlorinated chicken, thank you very much. I quite like having good food welfare standards and safety standards on products when I go and buy toys for my son. I think it's good that we've got rules about how much lead you're allowed to have in the paint and all of those things.
We can still have all of those things, can't we?
Well,
we can decide, but the Brexiteer would argue we can decide to have those things.
Yes, we can, but it's not as if we've got a massive problem with the ones that exist at the moment. And you've actually found that on lots of different issues, we've ended up having better regulation through having that agreed across the European Union, and the businesses then get the benefit of having one set of rules to comply with rather than 28 different sets.
Okay, we'll take two final questions and then we'll wrap up. So, woman in the middle row there. Yeah. We'll take this chap, the red top down at the front, please.
Hello. This sounds like quite a facetious question, but I mean it genuinely. Why are you a Liberal Democrat?
Okay.
And if we can quickly take a mic down to the chap at the front, that'd be great.
Hi. I used to live, I do live, I suppose, in what was your husband's old constituency in Chippenham. And that constituency swung to the Conservatives, and in 2017, the swing increased to the Conservatives. And that's something that was replicated across the country in many other constituencies. So my question is, how do you break the Conservative hold over rural areas? Because it seems to be somewhere that's been forgotten by the two other major parties in this country.
Sure. Well, if I take that question first, I think probably most people in the but nonetheless, you're right that those were significant swings, and it was the phenomenon that I talked about earlier, where it was people that had voted Liberal Democrat. It wasn't that they deserted us and went to the Labour Party and the Conservatives got through the middle. It was that they switched directly to the Conservatives and said, well, what's more important for me is to have a Conservative government. And I think this goes partly to that issue of when people are so terrified in those areas of what's on offer from the Labour Party, and there might be some areas of the country where it's in the opposite direction. And there is no doubt that some of that is a difficult problem to overcome. Where people would say to my husband, "Well, we think you're a great MP," But it's more important to me here that we have a Conservative MP. And that's kind of been part of the challenge that we've had since day one. And, part of that's about the issues and the offer that we have. Part of that's about credibility. And so that's about making sure that we do, fight in the council by-elections and show that we're gaining momentum. That's why it was a success and why it was important that at the election last year that we increased our number of MPs. All of this is part of the Lib Dem fight back. There is a different dynamic on British politics now where, it's not exclusively about a rural-urban thing, but more urban areas where more Remain voting. And this Remain-Leave dynamic is, a huge sort of filter through which the rest of politics is seen. And as a very strongly pro-European party, then that can be an additional barrier, and it probably has an impact on some of the areas where we're most likely to do well in future elections. And in answer to the question about why I'm a Liberal Democrat, I'm going to give you two answers. Maybe this is very Lib Dem of me, but I'm going to tell you why I became a Liberal Democrat and also why I am one now. So it was very straightforward for me when I was a teenager and I joined the party. There were two main issues that drew me to the Lib Dems. The first one was education, and that was at the time of Paddy Ashdown's leadership, a penny on income tax for education, which I believed and still believe is the sort of cornerstone of the successful society we want to build, because it has the positive impacts for so many other parts of society, from health to crime levels to the economy, and so investment in education is absolutely crucial, and that's why I was so proud of the pupil premium that we delivered in government, to really make sure that people from whatever background could get the best start in life. And the other reason that I joined was proportional representation. So I really am a true Liberal Democrat. That was one of my founding reasons. Perhaps slightly ironically, growing up in a constituency in the west of Scotland that I thought was dreadfully unfair, because when I was old enough to vote, I was like, well, it doesn't matter how I vote because it's always going to elect a Labour MP. And all right, there were boundary changes, but I was then later elected there. And then the SNP. So, it obviously wasn't always going to elect a Labour MP, but now Lib Dem again, which is nice. But the why I'm a Liberal Democrat, so those were the reasons I joined, but my sort of liberal journey, if you like, in understanding liberalism better, which I've done from a practical sense. I didn't study politics, so it wasn't like I, went and read John Stuart Mill and decided that I was a Lib Dem as a result. But it is about freedom. It is about a focus on the individual, that every individual matters, and that they are an individual. So it's not to say that we can't come together and have more power together. We absolutely can. But it is about valuing the person as an individual, and that's where my, support for things like equality come from, and also that sort of open-minded, open-hearted internationalist outlook, which I think the Liberal Democrats have at our core, that is part of my worldview of the kind of world that we want to live in, and that also is about the individual, really. It's about saying, yes, countries are important, nation-states are important as structures, but, we are, I think there is such a thing as a citizen of the world. We are all in this world together, and there's a lot of problems that we have to face jointly. Ones like climate change are really obvious, where, one country's actions impact on another country's actions, but wider challenges of poverty, of, extremism, crime, terrorism, and so on. So we have to work together, and that, for me, that comes back to my sort of basic, liberal outlook about freedom and the individual.
Have there been moments where, as part of that journey, your faith in the party has been tested?
There's been moments of frustration in the party. There's been times that I've come out of committee meetings and, head in your hands moments about sort of decisions being made, and there's been times, as I explain in the book, when I've been frustrated about, decisions that have been made by leadership and so on. But the party's bigger than that to me. It feels very much like a family. It's that kind of environment. Even though it's a much bigger family now that we've got, 100,000 members, which is many more than when I first joined. But it's, I suppose, there'll be individuals that sometimes do your head in, but that's life, really, isn't it? The basic values and principles that we're fighting for are bigger than that. And, I still absolutely see that we're a vehicle for change, and I hadn't ever imagined when I was elected at the age of 25. And I suppose I thought, well, I'm 25, maybe in my lifetime I might see the Lib Dems in government, because, you know, I might live for another 60 years or something. But it never crossed my mind that I would end up as a government minister able to put Liberal policies into action. And for all the difficulties that came with coalition government, as I say, you know, challenging compromises and such like, you know, you come into politics to change things, and, you know, I introduced shared parental leave, gender pay gap reporting, dramatic new rights in the Consumer Rights Act, you know, fairer treatment of suppliers and supermarkets with the Groceries Code Adjudicator, you know, improved insolvency regulation, improved corporate transparency in lots of different ways. You know, I feel so lucky that I've been in that position to be able to put into practice things that I believe, you know, Liberal values as a government minister. And I still think there's a lot in the world that needs to be fixed, which is why, having lost my seat in 2017, it took me about 2015, thank you. It took me about half a second in 2017 when Theresa May called the election to be absolutely clear that, you know, I wanted to come back. There's a lot more to do.
Thank you. That was fascinating. We're going to prove that universities spend their money very wisely by offering the audience a terrible glass of wine in a minute.
Fine by me.
If you could show your appreciation to Jo in the usual manner.